Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel session on the future of migration. My name is Alexander Betts. I'm a professor at the University of Oxford, and most of my research focuses on migration in its very diverse dimensions. We're privileged to have 45 minutes for a very exciting conversation today. We're joined by four terrific panelists. Melinda Bregu, who's Secretary General of the Regional Cooperation Council and based in Sarajevo. Bettina Schorler, who's head of Group Public Affairs at the ADECO Group, based here in Switzerland. Nena Stojkovic, who's Undersecretary General, focusing on global relations, diplomacy and digitization at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And last but not least, Ben Wright, who's founder and CEO of Velocity Global, based in Denver in the United States. I'll give a very brief introduction to the panel, and then we'll launch straight into a conversation, and there'll be time for all of you in the audience to contribute. So as we're discussing, think about your questions, think about your comments, and we will come to you. The context for this panel is that we see growth in migration around the world and transformation in the patterns of migration. And that's the result in changes in the nature of global economic activity and, of course, underlying inequalities within the global economy. The numbers of migrants in the world are actually quite contested. If we go to UN figures, there are some 281 million migrants, while the World Bank suggests there are 184 million. And that difference, which is as stark as whether it's 2.3% of the world's population or 3% of the world's population, depends on whether we define and measure migrants as people who are foreign-born or people living outside their country of citizenship. But what we're aware, whichever of those figures we take, is that migration is a genuinely global phenomenon. Some 40% of international migration takes place between developing countries and is to developing countries, while about 40% is to rich countries and around 20% in so-called middle-income countries. So we really want to have a conversation that's global. We come from a European perspective, but we want to see if we can diversify those perspectives. Now, we're, of course, at a summit that focuses on growth and jobs, and one might say, well, what place does the future of migration have in that conversation? And I'd suggest to you that migration is a crucial part of the business toolbox. It's core to our global economy. But because migration has focused, often in the public debate, on irregular migration and asylum, it's become very politicized. And we want to step back in this conversation and look very much at the economic dimensions while not neglecting the human side and the social side of those movements. We've often thought about aspects of the free movement of goods, services and finance as separate from the movement of labour across borders. And I think it's important when we think about the global economy to bring those back together, to empower business and the public sector to work together to create better policies that bring better opportunities for all. How do we create those win-win opportunities for people on the move, for sending and receiving countries, and also for business and the economy? In a recent Economist article, it was recognised that we could soon face a global competition for talent. Far from competing to keep people out, states and businesses may soon face a challenge of how to attract the brightest and the best. So it's in that context that I hope we'll have a really rich, wide-ranging, but yet focused conversation around the future, particularly of labour migration and people on the move with the aspiration to contribute to our economies and our societies. So if I might, I'll start with you, Melinda, and if I could ask you, how is it that you think we might shape migration in order to be beneficial for migrants, sending countries and receiving countries? How can we strive for those win-win outcomes, do you think?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor first with the toughest question on earth when it comes to migration. And I think if you're going to ask all the leaders and politicians on that one, they will just start speaking around or having some great words. But then the problem is how we face how we face the problem when we are confronted with the reality. So I come from the Western Balkans. So I'm an Albanian and I work in Bosnia-Herzegovina now on all the Western Balkans and Southeast Europe. And we are looking at the figures as we usually do, and not only for the purpose of this panel, but even for myself, I was astonished to see that like 2 years ago, the stock of migrants from the Western Balkans everywhere else globally exceeded 4.6 million. So people from the Western Balkans are like the largest diaspora. It's almost the same number of Poles that left their country during the migration phases. But consider that Poland is like the double of the Western Balkans, like 17.5. We are 17.5% million inhabitants in the region. So I come from a region that has exported migration and has as well been part of the joint forces as it is part of the European common policy on migration. Because you know that the foreign policy of the Western Balkans is aligned with the sea policy. So for us, we have like the two folds or two sides of the coin. And we do know that by exporting migrants, then we lose a lot of talents. You lose like the intellectual capacity in the region. And that is pretty hard to be like substituted in a near time. So we see that people from the Western Balkans, especially those who have who are skilled, talented in ICT, but even like doctors and nurses, and even like the experts or the workers, and lately even the low-skilled workers, are highly asked from the European countries, like Germany, for example. So from one side, I say that this should be kept in mind as well. While every or any EU or Western country as well has a necessity for workers or migrants, the first thing is first to come to a discussion and open a clear and transparent discussion with the countries where they are coming from. And you might have heard about the discussion that the Albanian Prime Minister was having with the German Chancellor whenever it goes to the cost of one doctor or nurse out of the system. So it's almost like 150,000 euros per one doctor that the state is investing in educating a doctor. And then what happens? Immediately after, we just go to Germany. So I think that transparency is there in need. And I'm not speaking of those operational, let's say, plans that the EU has been asked to every country in respecting the migration or trying to manage the migration flows, like the control of border, like avoiding or limiting the number of smuggling migrants, which brings again to another big problem, like of human trafficking and so on. The second thing is like communication. We live in a time when disinformation and bad news is really ruining our lives. And I know, as it usually is said in the British or Western media, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. But portraying migrants as creatures who are coming only to destroy your country image, projecting and bringing problems as well, kidnapping, or being part of the organized crime, or drug dealers and so on. And again, this happened with Albanians in UK. Unfortunately, during the last months, even like from a minister of UK, the interior minister. This doesn't help the story of migrants, and this doesn't help building a narrative that migrants are always like wanted but never welcomed. So, or it helps building this narrative, but it doesn't make them and their families feeling welcome. On the other side of the coin, from the Balkans, I think there is a lot to be done. We should invest more. And that was the focus of our discussions today. Supporting innovation, supporting the start-uppers, trying to invest more in research and education. In the region, it's only 0.4% invested budgetary-wise in the research, innovation, and education. This makes the people, and especially the youngsters, and when I speak of the region, I speak of 6 countries of the Western Balkans, the youngsters that are 34% unemployed, to leave their countries. And by leaving their countries, they are voting on their feet. So this brings to me another example in the bigger panorama of the democracy in our countries and then how we do treat migrants. Usually, we are welcoming. Hospitality is high. But whenever we need to keep focus on drafting, aligning policies and having strategies to keep our people in the region, there it's not that we are really doing great.
So
I hope I gave like a kind of an answer.
it's a great answer.
Thank you.
3 really important messages there, that we need to have the sending countries in the conversation, whether it's in the Western Balkans or elsewhere. We need to challenge narratives of stigma and demonization, for instance, of Albanians in parts of Europe, including my own country. And we also need to recognize that educational opportunities and the availability of opportunities for young people has a huge bearing. Bettina, maybe we could come to you and think about the kind of regulatory framework in some of those receiving countries. What benefits do you think policies like temporary work visas, but also mobility partnerships can offer in terms of creating these kinds of economic opportunities from which everyone can benefit?
Well, thank you for attributing the easiest question to me on this panel, because I can confirm from the private sector perspective that any of these policy instruments is beneficial. Anything that will foster and allow for migration is welcome. And I'm here wearing 2 hats as it is. One, as a major employer around the world, who of course is the first, recipient himself of a very mobile workforce, and therefore depends again on every possible legal way that governments and organizations find in making this migration and mobility happen. And on the other side, we are, as the Adecco Group, one of the largest staffing companies, that is there to facilitate the employment of workers of all skills levels and of all nationalities to the demand side. And there, of course, we are the first ones who would be delighted to put migrants to work, to provide that opportunity in a very, again, legal, well-coordinated way, with contracts that are linked with benefits, with training opportunities. In many countries where allowed, we provide skilling and upskilling, starting with language opportunities, of course. So this, per se, is a policy instrument which, unfortunately, though, I must say, is not given in every country. Here I can, and I have to mention the example of Germany right now, where we know that integration of migrants, like in so many other countries, is highly political, but for some reason, there's a proposal on the table right now which would not allow private employment services companies, again, to provide that first entry job in Germany. So coming back to the broad question, let's not be shy and throw everything we have in the policy instrument toolbox at ensuring that migrants can work where they are.
And are there particular policies that you'd really like to see? If there was one policy that you as the group would like to see introduced, what would it be?
I think here I would like to focus on the skills recognition piece, because too often do we see that as a hindrance for migrants to then also take the step. Once all the legal elements are out of the way, usually there is an element of skills recognition that then is another tumbling stone. So if we could focus on that one as well, it's the growth summit, it's the jobs angle, I think that would be a game changer.
And Ben, I can see you nodding throughout in vehement agreement. Does it look similar from your perspective in the US?
Completely. I think I love that comment. I love that point. I think you really have kind of 2 issues as we get to the job point. And we were talking earlier, there's a whole gap before you even get to the point of jobs, right? But when you get to the point of jobs, there's real gaps in terms of really connecting these migrants with the work. And it depends on kind of under which circumstances that migrant happens, right, and occurs, and how you're moving. But another is absolutely, it's how you access those skills. How do we know what skills these workers have? So if you connect the companies and the jobs to the workers, how can we be certain they actually have the jobs and the skills necessary to kind of do that work? So I think that's really important.
Fantastic. So we've covered a little bit a perspective from sending countries. We've thought a little bit about the perspective of regulation within receiving countries and how that affects the role that business has in creating mobility opportunities. Let's maybe perhaps touch, Nena, on the perspective of migrants themselves, the people on the move. You're now working with IFRC. There's a big human and indeed humanitarian dimension to mobility. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about what you think the needs are in terms of protection, fair wages, flexibility, opportunities to learn and flourish? What would you like to accentuate from a migrant's perspective?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to take a humanitarian perspective into this. My background is also in the World Bank and IFC, and of course there we talked a lot about the jobs and skills and vocational training and how we can grow economies through the growth of jobs and inclusion, right? But now what we see in Red Cross being in 192 countries and covering practically all the points of origin, all the countries where these people move through and the final destinations. And this is not just country to country. I also wanted to say that displacement happens within countries and may be equally difficult to go from one community to another one and look for livelihood and for jobs. We're talking about all these millions of people that we, through our 192 national societies, we see on a daily basis. We see them at what we call humanitarian service points. We see women and children. We see issues that happen there. We see difficulties of, let's say, moving to Darien Gap in Panama and all these people who move from Central America towards the US. It's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And now we talk about what happens when they reach their final destination. Before they can even think about jobs, they need a place to live. They need some food. They need some medicine. They need some help and access, perhaps, to health, education. They need to put their kids into school. And Bettina, you mentioned the language barrier. Like even before we start talking about integrating them into the economy, they have all these kind of life issues that someone needs to take care of. And this is where humanitarian organizations normally would come in. They would provide shelter, food, medicine, cash, more increasingly, to let them settle in a dignified way. And I wanted to highlight IFRC's program together with Turkish Red Crescent. We support 1.8 million Syrian refugees on a monthly basis through funding by the European Union, which is absolutely huge. It's half of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, so that they can have a dignified settling in, and that was happening in the initial phases. But now, with the help of Turkish Red Crescent, the vocational training, volunteers working with those migrants, helping them understand the language, how to write job applications, like very human touch, right? Person to person, we have been able to see huge progress of integrating those migrants into the economy. They became sought after in particular sectors, in particular regions of Turkey. And I could see that path actually as a path where we can collaborate together. The humanitarians, the governments on all the policies that Bettina talked about, the skilling, the jobs that private sector will create, and then some development organizations also would probably have some role also to stimulate that. So that's how I see the whole journey from beginning to them actually being properly included in the economy.
So throughout that journey, the human side is important, and the social protection piece is an important complement to everything else. For somebody to be able to contribute, they have to be able to flourish.
Exactly.
Would anyone else like to come in on that perspective? Melinda, I mean, you've focused on a little bit on the experience, for instance, of migrants from the Western Balkans when they move, for instance, to Western Europe and face particular challenges. You used the example of Albanians. Are there measures that you think businesses and governments can take to better integrate migrants in order to enable them to flourish within labour markets?
Again, like I'm thinking twofold. The biggest problem whenever I see societies that are like, or as we started like with the Growth Summit, emerging markets, or underdeveloped countries, or not fully developed ones. The biggest problem is like how to make great use of your own resources. And then definitely enhance everything with the help of others, like be those foreign direct investments and so on. And I see that whenever it comes, especially to this region, so I cannot speak globally because it's not that I'm writing my PhD thesis in here. So I'm working with the Western Balkans, and that's why I'm using that. And it's still, like last year, Western Balkans was the #1, the major route for the flow of migrants to the other European countries. And that's why it made as well EU feeling a bit more anxious and keeping the Western Balkans immediately aligned, and made all the ministers of interior sign those 20 operational tasks in order to have and follow the same policy, migratory policy with the EU. The problem and the idea of the migrants, and especially today, is not that they don't know that their countries are not as rich as another Western country. The problem is that they have been waiting so long. And again, I'm referring to this region. I'm not speaking like to other continents, to Africa or so on. Another story can be, and another judgment or analysis will be valid in there. But from here, they've been waiting for too long for their countries to improve highly and to be functioning democracies with a functioning market where all the youngsters could find a job and not to be unemployed, where the women can find a job in the labor market, where conflicts between societies are not going to ruin their lives during the war, after the war, and then even afterwards. And by not facing this kind of realities within their own countries, then it comes a moment in life when children grew up, they become parents, and their hopes are like drying and fading out, and they are thinking on their own children. And that's what's happening with the Western Balkans. Make it like, or combine it with the demographic changes in there. So we are not really like giving birth to babies, as this was a trend like 10 years ago. So the societies are growing older. People that are leaving are building up the diaspora. The diaspora is keeping their families alive in the region or making them live like within a standard by bringing the remittances or money back. And then you have the youngsters who are eager. Even like the societies changed, social media gave to them a lot of more frustration. They want to live a life that is happier. They want to live a life in colors. Their parents waited for 30 years. They cannot think that they should wait for another 30 years, as long as they will be either an EU member state, for example, or then they will be as good as an EU member state. And then builds day by day the story of migrants. So it's not even a flux. They are not leaving like the Ukrainians from the war, or like the Bosnians were leaving 30 years ago from the war. Now they are leaving because they don't think they deserve the reality they are living with and living to. So, and this makes the story a bit more different. This is a different type of migrants. And I'm totally off scheme now. You didn't tell me, anyone told me that I was going to speak about this. Nevertheless, so, but there is a different typology of migrant in this perspective. It's not the migrant who is leaving from Ukraine and they are joining somebody like a family member or somebody they know in Austria or somewhere else, and they are just leaving their country because there is a war in there. The migrants coming from regions that are within this kind of development, like the Western Balkans, are the migrants that are protesting. And this is like another message that the countries that are receiving these migrants should understand. Something is not going wrong only in terms of economic development in these countries, but it's going wrong in terms of offering the chances to the people to stay and build their life in their homelands. So for me, this is a different story of migrants. And that's why you hear more on the smuggling. And these smuggling cycles have been like stopped some years ago.
A really important reminder that migration takes place in the context of hope and aspiration.
Yeah.
But also, I think what you've emphasised is that the opportunities for people to move have an effect on the opportunities for people back home, that remittances, diasporas form, and those transnational connections are very important for economic opportunity. Nena, you wanted to come in.
You inspired me to think about prevention, right? Migration is a consequence in a way. The numbers that you provided, I mean, for 2021, more than 90% of migration happened because of the climate change issues, right? And I'm linking migration also to, again, at the origin side, not at what happens when people actually move, to what we can collectively do between development actors, governments, to prevent people from migrating, building better homes, stronger, more resilient communities so that they don't need to run away whenever the next flood or drought come, right? So I wouldn't like to lose the thought of prevention, because we often talk about the consequence. And then the second point that I wanted to mention, and you said it as well, it's highly political, especially in European context, but also American context, to talk about migration. And we as Red Cross, even though that's one of the core areas of our activities, this is where it's really heartbreaking to support people who move through these humanitarian service points. There is no funding for this, per se, for the humanitarian angle. So the only option for us is to pursue prevention at the origin, right? Or to work with, like the example in Turkey, with the government and private sector to create opportunities for those people when they land in a certain place.
Bettina.
I need to pick this up, and this is highly politically incorrect, and I'm the private sector, so who am I to talk? But it's highly political, and that's exactly the point, isn't it? There are certain governments that are picking the topic up, but too many are just going eyes shut at this. You know, the notion of rights-based labor migration agreements, how can we today in 2023 still not have in place agreements between countries that recognize that this is a reality? And what triggered me, you mentioned the interior ministers. Now we're at the Growth Summit or the Jobs Summit. How often do labor ministers also sit at that table? As far as I know, never. Now, this is all an indication for me on how this topic is just not being given the attention that it should. We talk about the future of labor migration. It's the present of migration that we need to look at and just finally look ourselves in the mirror. All government representatives, I call on you. How much longer can we continue to let this happen as it is? And the private sector is here to step in, to step up, to take on, to give jobs. We're only waiting, right? There is the talent shortage. We need migrants. And by the way, I think we need to differentiate between refugees and migrants as well. But as it is, as you can see, a very strong emotional call to make this the priority that it should be finally.
Yeah, a really strong call for us to take this seriously as not only the business sector, but also the public sector. This brings me nicely to the final question I'd like to ask before we'll open up to all of you in the audience. And Ben, I want to come to you, and it wouldn't be the World Economic Forum without me asking about what role public-private partnership and collaboration can play in this space. At Velocity Global, you sit at the forefront of the competition for talent. What kind of role do you foresee for public-private partnership in this space?
You know, so much of it was actually talked about in various forums here today. What's clear is that, you know, the losers in this space are those who provide protectionism in their countries, right? If there's protectionism, not allowing the visas, not allowing people to work, right? Making it difficult for people to work in those countries, whether it's, you know, from a refugee perspective, whether it's kind of a forced migration, or whether it's simply post-pandemic, people wanting the ability to work from anywhere, right? Which is this whole distributed work thing has absolutely changed. I mean, look no further than the migration that has happened from Silicon Valley up to Vancouver and Toronto, right? I mean, so many incredibly talented workers have come to the US in the tech industry who in the last 3-4 years have woken up and said, you know, this doesn't feel like the place for me anymore because of some of the policies and what's been put in place. And so that great talent that we have brought to the US has since moved across the border into a place that is more welcoming. Look no further too than, you know, there's certain governments who have actually really embraced this distributed work and provided, you know, 1-year working visas for anybody who wants to come work in the country, and completely, you know, reducing and relaxing some of the controls. You still have to have a visa, but come work in our country for a year. How much does that benefit the home country as well as that host country? Because maybe you stay, potentially you're bringing good jobs to it, you potentially are, you know, may move back home, but then have a network of great workers in that country that build up, you know, Western jobs in that place. And so that collaboration absolutely needs to take place. And again, we're talking kind of on both ends of the extreme, whether it's that distributed worker, you know, 2 out of every 3 workers say in the next 12 months they want to work somewhere different. right? And if you go to the director and above level, it's 3 out of 4. So it's up and down the organization. People want the ability to work from somewhere else. Companies have to be able to provide it. Governments need to get on board to say, we need to enable this to happen. But on the other end of the spectrum, when it's potentially not, that employee's or that individual's choice, I have to flee this country, I have to go to this country, I have to migrate for a particular reason, we have to work with local governments to make that connection. The basic human needs have to be taken care of, but you're right, that next step is we have to connect the companies with the actual workers, and there's a huge opportunity there with Red Cross, obviously with governments themselves to catalog, to get those skills documented in such a way where we can connect the two together.
Bettina.
Can I add an element here? And here, unfortunately, I'm in the recruitment space. But guys, there's too many companies out there that are just criminals. They're rogue providers. We've worked together as an industry with the International Organization of Migration to put in place fair recruitment standards. And of course, what we need here is to enforce those and to police and be ruthless for all of those, and you alluded to it, you did as well, all those illicit, illegal, terrible human trafficking-like conditions. Again, that is not acceptable. So let's work in that case. We are the legal, compliant, well-regulated industry standing ready to make this happen. Let's do that and let's clamp down all the bad guys.
So business needs government in order to liberalise but also to regulate appropriately, and government also needs business, so there's scope to work together. Let's open up. We've had a lot of food for thought. Hopefully it's whetted your appetites and you have questions and ideas you'd like to contribute. So please raise your hand if you'd like to come in, and if you could introduce yourself, that would be great. So.
Hello, my name is Kim Smelter. I'm Director General of the European Network Against Racism. I thank the panel for the discussions and also for the nuances that you've brought to the debate. And one of the questions I wanted to ask the panel is actually how do we challenge the narrative? So we see, particularly in Western Europe, that there are a number of countries, a number of governments, and we're saying could be part of the solution, but at the moment are actually contributing to this environment of fear, to the scapegoating of migrants, to this idea that migrants are costing social security and those types of things. How do we actually counter that narrative with the facts that actually migrants are necessary, or migrants are going to be the key to ensuring that social security systems across Europe actually are viable, and yet somehow that conversation doesn't come through. The conversation we hear is very much the illegal migration, the inability of migrants to contribute and to integrate. So I wonder, what can we do to actually counter that narrative so that we actually can deliver solutions which are factual-based and evidence-based?
How do we change the narrative in order to shift the politics that you've described? Another very straightforward, easy question for you all.
Yes, so I'll take it, as usual.
Excellent.
I love it, and Enar, of course, the Adecco Group is one of the founding members, and my colleague Bruce Rock, incredibly involved, so very nice to see you. I didn't know you were here, so nice surprise. How do we challenge the narrative? Guys, these are all, we know it all. It's all out there, right? So do we need a big campaign? Do we need honesty? Do we need, the good examples? Yes. I mean, we as a company do everything we can to bring the good examples. Usually, I'm now pointing fingers to the media and the press. They don't want to hear those. They want to hear the bad stuff. It's one of those policy areas where the system is broken. And we're letting it happen. So I'm one of those who finds it unacceptable, as you can see it. There's players out there who are willing to shift it. To answer your question, I would say it's a campaign. It's a positive campaign, right? And honesty.
Coupled with perhaps with humanitarian diplomacy at all levels. Obviously, EU is obvious. What we see is that governments are struggling to convince their domestic population that this makes sense. And this is where every single individual in that particular country, right, has a role to play, to understand the benefits, right? And because that's where the governments get shy from supporting migrants and migration, and I would say all the work that we are doing as Red Cross.
And that as well, I mean, there's an inherent friction and conflict in that your voter base, as these governments, right, are, we're going to protect your jobs, right? It's such an easy talk track, and it can be so bastardized as you take it, to those nth degree levels. And I think that's something, honestly, that we'll probably always fight against. And so many of the regulations that we see pop up around the world are related to that, right? It's really kind of too easy of a talk track, pandering to that voter base in whatever country that happens to be in. The good news is there is no more exciting time, I believe, in the history of the world of democratizing work. We today have the ability to actually employ people anywhere, right? There's new platforms in place, there's accessibility. You have the ability to hire people anywhere, and I got the jobs report. I looked at the jobs report this morning, so I didn't have a chance to review the whole thing. It's a 300-page document. It's going to take me a little while. But the first few pages that I read and I got through is, those developed markets are having a labor shortage, right? But the more up-and-coming markets are still dealing with kind of some real issues around unemployment. And with migration, that you can help some of these countries where they have a labor shortage. You just have to be able to access that talent. And it's a completely different conversation, but on a panel earlier today, someone said, you're not going to lose your job due to AI. You're going to lose your job because someone is using AI in their job, right? You have to embrace it. If you're an employer, you need to be able to go access talent anywhere. And if you're not accessing talent that may not be being accessed in that country because of racism, because of bias, because of those sort of things, the local companies are going to miss out because there's incredible talent sitting right there at your fingertips. And if you truly democratize it and make it global, which is really starting to happen, you can force people along that path.
Melinda.
Well, I'm starting to enjoy myself in this narrative now. So I was thinking we need leadership, not small-minded people, not politicians that will make misuse of every migrant flow only for their daily politics and to cover up a bit whatever is going wrong within their national politics. We need partnership, definitely, public and private partnership. We need innovation. We have to think on how to innovate first and open our minds, as I said, whenever it comes to the certain or different levels or typology of migrants. And we need a great communication. Because bad news is always good news. But by always emphasizing on bad news, then we are not doing anything else but just losing the sense of the whole story. There are countries that have been built up and societies that live due to the contribution of migrants. And this is not going to change in the near future, not even in midterm. There will always be people in need to migrate, and that's the sense of mobility. That's the sense of living borderless as well, to move freely. But in certain moments of time and of life, we need to have strong-minded people, not small-minded people, and the partnership as well, which are the main, and communication, as I said, so the main three things that we can all do together.
And as a researcher, I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of also say that evidence has an important role to play in this, that there's a big behavioural science piece underlying this about knowing what levers we can shift from the public and private sector to change public attitudes amongst the general population and move the politics. Yes. Oh yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Cindy Godwin, Head of Social Responsibility for the management consulting firm Alex Partners, also on the board of Global Dignity, an NGO founded at the World Economic Forum. I appreciate all the different perspectives that we've heard today. This is such a huge topic. My question is for Bettina, where you said for the private sector to step up. If an organization, a global organization, has not been accustomed to integrating migrant workers into its pipeline and into its organizational culture, where do you suggest that they start? Is it country by country or systemically from the top or somewhere else?
I suggest that they reach out to a private employment services company to support them in the process. Great way to start. I would know one specifically. And no, the country by country aspect makes sense to me, but this is where the notion of partnership comes in as well. Reach out to your community. There will be centers that know that there are migrants in that area. So it's not even country, it's region or even city by city. And actually, make it a program, obviously internally, that fits your culture, that is being communicated broadly. So engage all your employees from early on and communicate on it the way that we've been talking about. So go at it with a big bang, I would say as well. Create the partnerships as local as possible, because in all countries where you operate, there will be slight differences, which you have to take into consideration. Also when it comes to the labor laws to actually employ the migrants.
Could you go 2 rows forwards, just here?
Lots of choice. More actually a comment, or at least sort of backing up what Bettina mentioned. So I'm Catherine Brown, I'm with Visa. I used to be with the World Economic Forum, in fact, and this is a very dear topic to my heart. But once I started at Visa 2 years ago, we went about it just that way. When I brought the topic of migration into what we do, I'm the head of inclusive impact and sustainability, so I looked at it as we're a huge company, or at least with scale for financial empowerment, in particular digital and financial skills for migration. And I actually approached very much with hands in front of my eyes, my CEO ready to get smacked and say, what are you thinking? This is absolutely too political. No, Visa's doors swung wide open, said, this is brilliant, what can we do? We'd love to help. And actually where we're making progress is on talent, much more so than actually is what we do as a business, our core business, because we're a heavily regulated industry. And there is so much that we need to fix vis-a-vis KYC, know your consumer, and migration. So it's interesting because I actually thought a lot of the hesitation would be coming from the institution, from the organization. Absolutely not. It's still the regulatory environment around that just isn't designed to allow for, for looking at all communities. So it's more of a comment than a question, but to your point, Bettina, very much how we went about it.
Hi, thank you very much for the lovely insights. My name is Ioanna Koutava. I work on an NGO in Greece, and we make sure to provide free medicines to non-profits, including for migrants and refugees. We work with unused medicine. And one of the things that we've worked a lot on is obtaining real-time data on the needs that exist, on the demographics, on the populations of beneficiaries we are serving. And it has been a major challenge. And we do this through technology. And I was wondering, you also mentioned behavioral sciences for studying how the public may react to policies that could be even very progressive. And I was wondering, from your experience, what are the gaps you're observing in terms of knowing the situation of migration in our countries right now, like knowing who are the people that have migrated, what are their skills, what are their situations, and if there are such gaps, such unknown factors, what problems are those creating? Thank you.
It's a very big question to end on. What do you not know that you would like to know?
All these things that you mentioned are important, right? Where do they come from? Do they plan to stay? Do they plan just to transit? The skills, as you said, the experience, the languages. And we were following that, the humanitarian service points for all the people leaving Ukraine. It was mostly women and children into all, I think, 10 plus countries, neighboring countries. So there is some data on it. I would say in Ukrainian case, certainly better than in some other cases. But I'm not sure that you're also good at sharing, for example. And in your case in Greece, I mean, it would be a good question to Greek Red Cross to understand whether they have the data on all the migrants into Greece.
This is a very big topic and one we could continue to speak about for a very long time. In order to think about the future of migration, we've also had to grapple very much with the present of migration. I think from all the panelists, there's been a very strong call that the regulatory framework as it is and the politics underlying it isn't fit to create the kind of liberal opportunities and freedom of movement that's needed by business and by the economy. So one of the challenges I think all the panelists have laid down very clearly is how we cooperate better across the public and private sectors, globally, nationally, but also I've heard a very strong emphasis on the local in order to open up those opportunities for the benefits of migrants, receiving countries, sending countries, and business and the economy. So the challenges for all of us to grapple with. Thank you very much, Ben, Nena, Bettina, Mylinda, and all of you for your great questions and engagement.